I wear my bee shirt.
Nice.
So this is, so I work in sunflower, hybrid, industrial, like large-scale sunflower, which maybe it doesn't sound great, but it's kind of beautiful, you know, when you're like driving in the Central Valley to actually see flowers. And they actually are a very important resource for bees. This is Sebastra obliqua, the teddy bear bee. Really adorable. It's a hairy-legged bee, but a native bee pollinating a crop that's increasing in the amount that they're growing every year. Pretty important. And also, because there's just, like I said, so few resources in agricultural landscapes, it turns out to be really important for native bees. So there are some ways that our food system now just kind of forces you to look at mass flowering crops as a resource for bees. So counterintuitive. But I wanted to start off, you guys probably all know this, but just reminding you what pollination is, right? It's basically when bees help plants have sex. You transport pollen from one plant to another. Plants, of course, can self-pollinate, but it's not as common. Sometimes it doesn't lead to as viable seed set. And we also classify pollination as an ecosystem service. There's a lot of different ones, but basically it's the benefits that humans derive from nature. So just looking out the window, it's very beautiful, right? That aesthetics is one ecosystem service that you can get. Carbon sequestration, a very big one. Water quality, right, from kind of erosion control or filtering. Pest control is another one, but pollination is a really big one that's gotten a lot of attention. And pollination, of course, is really important, right? So I was mentioning that I worked in natural areas, and most flowering plants, like the ones you love, poppies, goldfields, they're blooming right now. I was just in Point Reyes the other day. There are tons of them. They all need pollinators. But we also need pollinators for our food crops too, not just for our natural systems. So we like to say, this is like tried and true, whenever you hear somebody talk about bees, I feel like you're going to hear this fact, so it's good to remember. 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you eat comes from a pollinated plant. Kind of a weird thing to think about, but so there's wind pollination, right? Oak trees have wind pollination. They just scatter pollen from their catkins in the wind. Wheat, corn, wind pollination. So a lot of like your basic staple crops are that type. But all of your fruits and vegetables are pollinated. So apples, squash, almonds, sunflower oil, even canola oil. I mean, a lot of things that you wouldn't think about. And those somebody was saying that they're interested in nutrition. Yeah, so the majority of the micronutrients and vitamins that we get from food are from these pollinated crops. So vitamin C, right, comes a lot from brassicas, right, like kale, broccoli, but those, even though they don't need pollination at the point when we eat them, they need pollinators to produce those seeds that we then plant. And then, of course, oranges, right? We'd all have scurvy without vitamin C. So they're super, super important for our own diets. And, of course, they're really important to farmers and for the global economy. This estimate was from years ago, so the number is probably a lot higher, but at least $200 billion a year is generated from these pollinated crops. Some other pollinated crops I should also mention, if any of you drink milk, alfalfa is something that gets pollinated and is the main thing that cattle consume before they produce milk. I should put up, maybe next time I give the talk I would, have you guys seen the internet meme where they took all of the food out of a grocery store, produce section, that was stuff that was pollinated? Wow. It's really cool. All right, well, clearly I'll put this up next time. I don't think I have a good internet connection, or I try to find it really quickly. But basically the contrast is really stark. Or they do the same thing with your breakfast plate. You know, you'd have your piece of toast, but you'd lose your butter. Even coffee is a pollinated crop, right? So,
and chocolate. And
yes, very importantly chocolate. Although chocolate is by thrips, so these tiny little, or midges. Chocolate is by midgets, these tiny little microscopic flies. There's a girl, Emily, in my lab that studies them. So not by these big charismatic pollinators. But Yeah, and this includes a bunch of different kinds. I think eventually I talk about different kinds of pollinators. Okay, pollination is very important. This shows the amount of pollinated crops that have been planted over time. So 1960, 2000, so you can see non-dependent ones, the green line, they kind of stay pretty flat. So we're planting about the same amount of those. But if you look at those pollinated crops I talk about, it's almost like, not just it's like a linear increase becoming almost exponential over time. So we're planting more and more of them. At the same time, honeybees are declining very precipitously. And we still haven't figured out kind of what is causing colony collapse, but honeybees are also ailed by a lot of
I
different...
disagree with that, by the way, but go ahead.
Of what causes colony collapse?
Yeah, I think
I would
it's
say that
pretty
there's
clear.
scientific community has uncertainty, and there's a lot of people...
But I feel like the scientific community mostly has uncertainty because of the activities of Bayer, Syngenta, and Monsanto.
Yes. So, and their work with the Department of Defense and the research that they do. But there's Varroa mites, and there's a lot of other kind of ailments that honeybees have that have been increasing over time as more and more people keep bees. So colony collapse, basically, the indicative hallmarks of that are you have these big colonies with a queen. I guess it's just this slide. But basically, you have these colonies. The queen is still laying eggs, but all of the workers kind of abandon it. So what do you think is causing?
I think it's pretty clear that it's neonicotinoid pesticides produced by Bayer and one by Syngenta. And then, let's just look at it. Okay, what are the symptoms of Varroa mites? Varroa mites suck their blood. It's like if you had a rabbit on you sucking your blood, kind of. And then there's also this thing called the nosmia which lives on them, which also causes a disease. What are the symptoms of colony collapse disorder? There's two symptoms. Well, one is death, but the other ones are it messes with their brains, right? It creates a neurological dysfunction, and they can't find their way home, which is why all the bee colonies were just disappearing,
right.
And then the other thing it causes a weakened immune system, which is why in the past 10 years we've got all this proliferation of these otherwise fairly rare bee diseases, and then Bayer would like you to think that their official position is it's bad bee practices, it's climate change, it's cell phones, it's feeding bees high fructose corn syrup, trucking them around, the Varroa mites, the nosmia. And if you were a scientist, say, I don't know how, but if you were like PhD person and you go out and you say, yes, it's Bayer killing the bees, Bayer's going to call you on the phone, and some creepy men in black might come, and then they're going to try, and they're going to be like, we're going to sue you.
Well, so here are some things that I think are interesting. There are people that have put colonies of, say, bumblebees out by fields that have neonicotinoids either sprayed on them or in a seed coat. So one way that people are delivering neonicotinoids, have you all heard about them? Do you know what they are? Okay. So they're basically, originally people used tobacco. It's the nicotine in it. You can spray, and it naturally provides, it's a natural insecticide, right? It's alleliopathic, insects don't want to eat it. So you can use it in organic agriculture as a way to secure your plants. And people took that and created this novel pathway, so they made a neonicotinoid that then is highly toxic to bees. A gram of this stuff is enough to kill 250,000 honeybees, so highly, highly lethal. They say that it doesn't get into the water systems, but it leaches into waterways. It accumulates in soil over 6 years. It kind of just linearly increases. So even if you plant a crop that has it and you move that crop away, most of this pesticide is going into the soil. So you can spray it on a plant, and it's actually probably better to spray it, but what people tend to do is they tend to coat the seeds with it.
Right.
So,
and they never sprayed them on the plants. They spray them on the ground, and they go inside of the plants.
No, they spray neonics on the plants.
Well, the difference though between if you spray them on the ground, they'll go inside of the plant.
Well, so usually they don't spray it on the ground; they just coat the seeds.
Right, that's the modern thing.
Yeah, when it germinates, it just starts taking in all of this pesticide, and it expresses it throughout the entire system. It expresses it in the leaves, in the pollen, and in the nectar. So what that means is that bees forage on it, and then they'll take it back to their nest, or they'll just consume like tiny little bits at a time, and over time that can have lethal and sublethal side effects. So sublethal, it can confuse them neurologically, you know, it can impede their immune system, all these different things. And so there are people in Britain in particular who've been, like there's some people who are really great advocates against neonicotinoids, and what they've done studies where they put bumblebee colonies next to canola fields that have had neonicotinoid seed coatings or not, and then they look for how the colony does over time, and they find that the colony produces fewer young, and at the end weigh less, so they're not able to bring back as many resources. So there is evidence that it does harm them. Yet there are a lot of other people who are looking at these pesticides, and in landscapes like the Central Valley where they're spraying a ton and they're putting tons of seed coats, and the bee populations don't seem to be super strongly negatively affected. So you're getting these like experimental trials where you do see a result, but on larger scales where it's much harder to pinpoint what the bees are doing, you can't see as much of an effect.
Right. I mean, I feel like the bees actually are smart enough to sort of avoid that. And you and I remember like in 2010 to 12, and it just seemed like all these bees were coming here. And you know, that was I mean, that's my own intuition, but like, I don't know, from my perspective is there's about 100 studies worldwide. There were 2 in the journal Science in 2012. And to my mind, if you, like Koch's postulates, if you accept Koch's postulates as how we determine what is causing a disease, like as far as my knowledge, and there are studies that are put out by Monsanto and Bayer and Syngenta, and they also have, like I find it's more difficult to talk to scientists because especially around here, a lot of scientists have already been, you know, given the stuff, but even, you know, it's like precautionary principles, shouldn't we just
Right, but
like,
I think, so I think the big test of it is that there's been a moratorium on using neonicotinoids.
Where?
In the EU.
It's only a partial ban. Because Bayer was like, look, if you ban these pesticides, we're going to have food shortages. So they made a partial ban. First of all, that partial ban only started like this year. And that partial ban allows them to spray crops in the winter. So that means once those crops are sprayed, they stay in there for 6 years, like you said. So those plants are still going to be poisoned. Then the biggest bee killers are like wind pollinators, like corn. Like there was that company Biologics, which used to be one of the foremost bee research companies in the world, and in 2010, because very dramatic, they're like, looking, here comes a swarm of bees, they fly through this Monsanto cornfield, half of them die, the other half develop colony collapse disorder. So they're like, look, Monsanto corn is killing the bees. So what happened? Monsanto somehow ended up buying Biologics. And now what do they have Biologics working on? They're working on neonicotinoid resistant bees called bees. That's what they have them working on. And Monsanto has this whole PR campaign. Look how awesome we are, we're saving the bees. But what they're really looking for is patentable bees. And at the same time, they're putting these neonicotinoid pesticides on all of their crops. So at the same time they're killing the bees, they're also trying to make bees that are resistant to what they're doing to kill the bees. You know, part of the reason why I'm so like, you know, I've been at this activism for a long time. I didn't tell you, but I told everyone else. But basically what I'm doing is I made a ballot measure for the city of Berkeley. Like right now, Lowe's and Home Depot are selling plants. Home Depot is calling them bee-friendly plants, but they have systemic pesticides on them already. So they're selling plants.
Valentine's Day protest against
yeah. So but they're selling plants that will kill bees and butterflies. And the nurseries around here that are smart enough to know, that care enough to know, they're freaked out because they're like, where do we buy plants so we can be sure are not going to kill bees and butterflies? And this is only like 2 or 3 months ago, you know, that this really started, that this has come on the radar. So it's a brand new thing. This is the first season everybody's buying, you know, these pesticide plants. And so what are we going to see? Are we going to see a bunch of bees, you know, dropping dead as all these people unwittingly are buying plants that kill the bees? So anyway, I made a Berkeley citywide measure to ban the pesticides that are killing the bees. I basically came here to ask for help gathering signatures. I've gathered about 1,000 signatures, but I made about twice that much, you know, to really put this on the ballot for 2014 by May 8th. So that's kind of what I'm asking for, is for people to, you know, in their classes or whatever, like you're in the bee field, you know, if you have classes or something, to be like, hey, you know, and then we can at least, you know, get it on the ballot. Like, even if you don't think that the evidence is there that neonicotinoid pesticides are the thing killing the bees or causing colony collapse disorder, which I think they are, still the precautionary principle, like we know that these pesticides
I agree
are.
that we should probably ban them, but I just think that rationally, given our regulatory climate and given how corporations give money to politicians, that it's not super feasible. And so I think looking at other ways to support bee populations is also good. So working from both fronts and trying also to get farmers not to just rely on honeybees. And so let's just talk a little bit about the distinction between honeybees and native bees, and we'll come back to this. I have more neonicotinoid stuff, I think, later. But it's really good points, and it's probably one of the biggest things in the field right now, is this kind of controversy, even though it probably shouldn't be a controversy, about colony collapse and about these really highly toxic pesticides. So most of you, pretty much anybody, when I tell them I study bees, they ask me about honeybees, and that's not what I do, right? You guys probably know about other bees, but maybe not. So honeybees are, you know, the classic European honeybee. They have a single queen who produces a pheromone to stop other workers from laying eggs. You have workers, and they're class divided. So you have workers, and then you also have nurses that tend the brood. They tend to be pretty easily managed, so we have, you know, different kinds of hives that people can move around, and that's part of what, you know, kind of spreads bee disease, but has also made them like very ubiquitous. And they provide the bulk of crop pollination, or quite a lot of it, because often they're the only bee that you can kind of like bring into a system and time it with when the crop is blooming. And they're very efficient pollinators in a way. They can communicate to one another using the waggle dance where floral resources are, so they can be like, oh, hey, over in this corner, there's something delicious. And so they'll like go back to the hive once they eat it, and they'll like kind of move in that direction, and how intensely they waggle kind of like tells them how good the food crop is. And basically bees antenate them, and they recruit bees to that area, and then those bees come back and tell the same story, and so that's kind of how it works. Okay, so what is a bee? Like, if honeybees are not the only bee, what characterizes a bee?
An insect.
All right, what else?
A flying insect.
But like,
They have a stinger
are wasps have stingers?
with their wings and they pollinate things.
How many wings do they have?
2,
4.
4 wings.
And then they have like large bodies, right? Like wasps have like a really
Narrow waist?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are the 4th ones little?
Yeah, so they have these things called hamuli, these little hooks on their forewings that attach to their hind wings and make it look like they just have 2 wings, but they actually have 4. Most insects have 4. Flies are one of the only Diptera, right? Die to Ptera wing, one of the only.
What does Hemiptera mean? Oh wait, that's what bees are?
Hymenoptera.
Hymenoptera. What does
Hemiptera-
Hymenoptera mean? Yeah, Hemipterans are bugs. I forgot. Yeah.
Yeah, those are true bugs. I don't know. I mean, good question. But there are Hymenoptera. Okay, so let's just go through really fast. So bees. Bees didn't exist at one point, like most insects. They diversified at the same time flowering plants diversified during the Cretaceous period. So suddenly, you know, there were just gymnosperms, and then all of a sudden there was like all this pollen and nectar. And bees were wasps, these digging wasps that live in the ground. And wasps are carnivorous, right? They'll eat tarantulas, they'll eat other wasps. They're parasitize other creatures. And they're basically wasps that decided to take advantage of this new resource boom and consume pollen and nectar. And because they eat pollen and nectar, they have these specialized structures on their bodies. They're usually hairs, but in the case of honeybees and bumblebees, they have corbicula, so these pollen baskets on their legs that they use to carry pollen. And there's about 20,000 species worldwide. Estimates range to nearly double that. and about 16,000 in California. And most are solitaries, right? They don't live in hives. So bees are related to wasps, right? They're descended from that. They're related to ants as well. They can be social and solitary. But one of the things that we look for in particular are these specialized hairs. They're usually branched so that pollen fits inside of them. So they're specialized insects that consume pollen and nectar for their young. So here are some examples, and I actually brought some for you to look at.
Holy shit.
I didn't bring every type, I just grabbed a few, and both of these are pretty much the same. Just pass them around. So, some bees, again, they'll carry their pollen on their leg back to the nest. These are called hairy-legged bees. Oh, sorry that this is very pixelated. There's also carpenter bees. You might know they like to chew into wood on your back porch. There's bees that look a lot like wasps, like this masked bee or the Hylaeus bee. There's ones that are really tiny and people tell me look like flies that you'll see in there, lazy blossom. There's parasitic bees. So you guys have heard of cuckoo birds that go into other birds' nests and lay their eggs there. That's what these bees do. This is like a hairy belly bee called osmia that's really metallic. Also, again, easily confused with flies. So huge diversity of bees. And bees, so bumblebee, one that most of you tend to know, right next to a honeybee, are really important pollinators. Not only are they really good at pollinating, but they can do a type of pollination that honeybees can't. They basically vibrate their wing muscles and do buzz pollination. So plants like tomatoes are a plant that needs buzz pollination. A lot of the solanums, in fact, do. So basically, they cause, when they vibrate at the frequency, which is the same as middle C, you can get tuning forks and do this to plants too, and just cause the pollen to like explosively to hiss as sort of just jump onto the bees. So again, honeybees can't do that. And another cool thing is that not just, like native bees are really efficient pollinators on their own, but when they're with honeybees, they're actually help honeybees be better pollinators. So we'll talk about that real fast.
Is the buzz pollination something that was like a co-evolutionary thing? Is there other stuff that would cause it to be let free?
So, interestingly, I just heard a talk on this about the evolution of buzz pollination, and it evolved multiple times and was lost multiple times in almost every bee lineage. There's 5 main families. And so it's basically stirring up a lot of debate. It's like what causes the evolution of that, and it's not really clear, but it doesn't seem to be really strong co-evolutionary forces.
Interesting.
So watermelon, very highly pollinator dependent crop. On this axis, you can see the number of honey bee visits to a flower and how much, like how many pollen grains they deposit on. So watermelon needs a whole bunch of different pollen grains deposited. You know, you spit the seeds out, right? Like it needs a lot to actually form a fruit. High pollination demand. And so you can see that even when you have tons of honeybee visits, they only ever deposit so much pollen. So they're not that great. Whereas if you look at native bee visits, as you get more and more visits from native bees, they deposit more and more pollen. So studies have shown, like this one, that if you have native bees in your system, you'll have higher watermelon fruit set, which is great. So that's just looking at them separately. Here's another example, sunflower, my study system. So sunflower bee, that was that one I showed at the very beginning, the spastra. There's hairy-legged bees in the boxes too. They're like kind of stripy and look like a really fuzzy honeybee. They will set a bunch of seeds after this is just single visit. The flowers were bagged. They open the bag, let a bee land, close it back up, and then look at how many seeds develop. So sunflower and hairy-legged bees set about 20 seeds. Bumblebees, the really tiny bees that are in there, don't set that many, and honeybees, way low at the bottom of the spectrum. So this is another kind of figure showing similar things, but this is how many native bees you have on the bottom versus how many honeybees. You can see when you don't have a lot of native bees or really honeybees, you get really low seed set. But as you increase the number of native bees, you get more honeybee visits, and that increases seed set. So what that shows is an interaction. Here's what's really going on. This is pretty cool. So this is the system I work in. Native bees, there's male and female bees, right? And the male bees are crazy. They just like zip up and down the rows, and like anything they come in contact with, they try to mate with. So when they try to do that to a honeybee, the honeybee's like, oh no! And it gets up and it flies to another flower. So basically it just creates a lot more pollen movement in that system. And the female bees kind of have the same thing. They'll be working their way around the flower, and then they'll meet and they'll both fly off. But it's really those male crazy bees that are basically, they elevate it. So when you have honeybees and native bees in the system, you get even higher effects than when you just have each alone interactive effect.
They can't produce valid offspring though. If the male natives were trying to mate with.
Oh, they don't actually mate.
Oh,
They
okay.
just attempt to mate, and then they fly off and go find their own species. And then this is just one more paper. This is from a science paper that came out last year. And what it's showing is in a ton of crops, from coffee, kiwi, strawberry, logan fruit, blueberry, buckwheat. Honeybees are less efficient pollinators than native bees. So in all of these cases, you see wild insects, most of which are bees, like I think 95% in this work that they looked at. So even when you have just honeybees, the native bees do a better job. If you can get native bees in your system, you'll probably, as a farmer or even as a home gardener, be able to increase your fruit set. So that's really great. Go team native bee. But pollinators are declining. With bumblebees, it's not just pesticides. They brought bumblebees, like Bombus terrestris, to different parts of the world because they're easier. They're a colonial bee, and so they're pretty easy to keep, a lot like honeybees. So they'll take them to greenhouses that are enclosed, like for tomato, and have them pollinate inside. But these bees escape, and they often, since they're managed, have much higher disease loads than the wild bees, and they'll escape, and you'll basically see this spillover, this ripple effect of bees dying close to these greenhouses, with fewer of them having diseases farther away, but then those diseases spread. There's a really cool paper I just read like a week ago where they were talking about bees can leave diseases on plants. So the virus will shed off of them and burrow into the pollen and be able to just subsist there until another bee picks it up. So pretty scary, right, for the bees. Very smart evolutionary thing that the virus has learned how to do, but probably part of what's causing this disease spread for bumblebees. But you can see almost every single bee from the past to the present in Britain declined, except for one, Bombus pascorum.
Where does this start?
This was in the 50s to the 2000s. But even, you can see, like, some of the most abundant species then are barely present now. They've looked at similar things. Franklin's bumblebee is a bumblebee that used to be quite common in Northern California, Southern Oregon. We think it's extinct now. People have gone back and looked for it every year. Bombus occidentalis, the western bumblebee, was the most abundant bumblebee, and right now people have been searching for it. Like in areas where like it was the main bee they caught, they'll catch just a few. So it's shared.
Wait, is that DuPont? DuPont?
No.
Okay.
This is just somebody's
It's a guy
last name.
person.
Not the chemicals. I don't think that they would be able to produce something that looked like this. The company. Yeah. But basically, it's really scary. Like you see some, and bumblebees are, I would argue, the most important pollinator, native pollinator in particular. So they're generalists. They're really big. They send out tons of their young. They also produce bees of different sizes. So they have different tongue lengths if they're different sizes, so they can pollinate a bunch of different floral tubes.
What do you mean by early, good and late?
Oh, sorry. So this is just like, bees tend to come out in pulses, so this would be like around now, midsummer, and then like
Oh,
August.
so it's the season.
Yeah, just the season.
You're talking about the season.
Yeah, so in all of the seasons, there were really steep declines.
Why did that one increase so much?
That is a good question. Possibly it was exhibiting some sort of like response to having not as many other bees around and was able to occupy that. Yeah, maybe it was occupying that niche. Maybe it's just genetically not as susceptible to some of the things that are driving down the other bumblebee populations. I don't know. These are all British species, and so I'm not as familiar with them as the California species. But bumblebees, they've done some studies where, or like simulations where they model like what would happen to a system, natural system, when you pull out different bee species. And if you just like randomly pull them out, like the bees stay pretty stable over time. But if you pull out the bumblebees first, these like very generalist bees, you basically have a collapse. Like the pollinators and the plants just decline. So they're like a key, I would argue that they're a keystone species. Okay. And this is going on at a global scale. There's been a lot of, I think more and more people are aware of it. A lot of you guys came because you've heard about this. We have pollinator stamps. There's a National Pollinator Week. There's a pollinator caucus in Congress where they learn about things. I'm trying to work with the Pollinator Partnership that's done a lot of campaigning in DC to try and improve policies to create some pollinator-related events. We might try, hopefully Berkeley Bowl will be into it, but doing some sort of tabling that remember how I talked about people like removing all the pollinated foods? So maybe we'll try and do something similar to that. Or I'm talking to Nerd Night about having some sort of pollinator-related talk, or maybe even like a field trip where we go to a restaurant and eat like just pollinated foods and learn about that. So I'll send it out to you guys if I end up managing to make anything happen. But it's going on, like we all know it is, and there's multiple causes. So let's go through them. We already know pesticides, huge one, right? What are other causes of decline that you guys think are affecting pollinators?
I feel like you kind of touched on this idea of almost food deserts for bees. Like if you're planting huge swaths of land with air pollinators, wind pollinators.
So
bees can get food.
agriculture or urbanization,
Yeah.
decreasing food. Yeah, definitely.
Climate change.
Yeah, there's been a lot of studies of like mismatch between pollinators. So plants get one set of cues to like bloom, and the pollinators get another, and suddenly they're not meeting at the time they need to, and their populations decline over time. So here are some of them. So not just so in these agricultural food deserts, you still have some resources, but not nearly as many or as diverse as you would. So not just like habitat destruction, but also degradation, right? Just decreasing the quality. Losing native flora. Agriculture is the main culprit. Like most of our global land area is taken over by agriculture. So it's one of the main drivers of basically species decline in general. Invasive plant species. So native pollinators will visit invasive plants, but they prefer to visit native plants. Invasive plants have less nutritious pollen. Usually, do you guys know much about invasive plants, like their characteristics, what makes them invasive? They tend to reproduce really fast. Like that's one of the main things they're great at. And so they often don't have the time to establish, get a lot of nutrients, provide really great pollen. And so that's one of the problems. Climate change, genetic disposition. I won't talk too much about their genetics because bees have fun, complicated genetics, but they're what's known as haplodiploid. So if you have a female bee, it has 2 sets of sex-determining chromosomes. Female bees come from a fertilized egg. Male bees they come from an unfertilized egg. So they just have 1/2 of their chromosome, they're haplo. So you can get situations where there's not enough outcrossing in the population. You get inbreeding depression, and you can get females bees that are diploid, but they look like they're male because they're just getting the signal for like the male traits. You even get these things called gynandromorphs, where you have bees that are look part male and part female. It's really interesting, but these are signs that bees are not doing well, and because they have this genetic structure, they might be more predisposed different genetic disorders. Pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides. So a lot of people don't think about it, but if you get rid of the flowers, you're harming, right? You're getting rid of the food for bees. And fungicides. So more evidence is showing that bees inadvertently pick up yeast from flowers. Just like, you know how you can put out a bowl of flour and you can get yeast to make sourdough? Yeasts are everywhere. They're super cool. I have a friend that studies them. Their evolution. You can get them to go back to multicellular, or to single cell to multicellular organisms. But if you spray a fungicide, you're killing the yeast. And the yeast helps kind of like ferment and pre-digest the pollen, making it easier for bees themselves to digest it. So you're basically limiting nutrients, which might make them more susceptible. And then, of course, tons of diseases, which you've already touched upon. So other things make bees really vulnerable. And this is because bees are what's known as central place foragers. You guys, I'll call central place foragers. You have a house. You go out to a grocery store, and then you come back and you eat your food, right? I mean, that's kind of the definition. So that's what bees do too. They have a nest. Most of them, like this mighty bee, nest in the ground, like 80% of them. And then they forage a certain distance, which is probably related to their body size. A lot of people have found like bumblebees forage the farthest, whereas those tiny little bees I passed around can forage only about 350 meters, so, you know, not even to that tree, like the closest tree out there. So they're very limited in where they decide to nest and what habitats they'll accept as nesting habitat, what flowers they go to. A lot of bees are specialists when they go to one type of flower, or they might just go to like a certain, like just asters or composites, so any daisy type flower, and their body size and the interactions between this. So this is what I study. It's like, what are the interactions between this? Where do bees nest in agricultural landscapes? How far do they forage, and what are they feeding on? This is what a typical ground nesting bee nest looks like. They dig down a chamber. They have different brood cells. Some of them are empty. This is for them to chill out at night if they're females. And then they'll lay, first they pack the pollen in, then they moisten it with some nectar and other excretions, and they lay a tiny little egg, which hatches into a larva, which eats the entire ball of pollen, and then at that point it defecates because it doesn't want to live in its excrement while it's eating. And then it pupates, and then this is a very short time period, it's like a week or two. And then it becomes an adult. And as an adult, it just chills out underground in what we call estivation, but it's basically like hibernation. They slow down their metabolism, and they wait. If they're like a solitary bee, they'll wait for those seasonal cues to tell them that the plants that they want to visit are there, and they will come out and forage for them. Sometimes they don't get those cues, and they can even stay in the ground another year. So this is a drought year, for example. A lot of signs are saying that a lot of the bees probably will just stay underground and try and wait and see if next year is a slightly better year. Wow. And come at them. But they can't do that for very long because they only have so much food that they've eaten. So if next year's a bad year and they all come out and it's still a drought year, you'll probably see pretty strong declines in bee populations over time until they build themselves back up. Do you guys have any questions about this? One of the cool things, too, that bees do is, so I told you that the females come from a fertilized egg and the males from an unfertilized egg, so they can decide where to put them. So some bees will put like the males really close to the top and the females at the bottom. The males climb out first and they basically just wait for the females at the nest entrances. It's pretty cool. Males live a very short period of time. Their goal is to mate and then they die. The females are the ones that live a bit longer. They can live 4 to 6 weeks. So you can get a type of bee kind of coming out. They have a short little season, you know, and then they'll all kind of disappear.
But that's only when they come out of hibernation. So a bee is either usually between like 4 to 6 years old, or 4 to 6 weeks old, or a year and 4 to 6 weeks old.
It's usually like the year. So the next year, it's only out for actively foraging and building a nest for 4 to 6 weeks.
Got it.
After a year of being underground. Or more. You also, there are social bees, so bumblebees, Sweat bees, these are social bees. So they actually have, they're called multivoltine, so they have multiple generations over the season. And so you'll actually see those bees over a really long period of time. So they'll be out now until August. But there'll be different individual bees over that entire time period. Oh, no, go for it.
So, if bees are nesting in the soil, do you think that possibly like soil health would have a lot to do with the decline as well?
It could definitely be the case. So bee nests are really hard to find, and this is something that I actually study, is where bees nest. Right now, if you have a farm, you're talking about an agricultural landscape, right? And this is the field, and this is like the field edge. People are saying that bees mostly only nest in the edges because they're not disturbed, and they think that bees can't survive and when there's agricultural tillage. And there's a grad student at UC Davis who went through and put bees into these cages, squash bees, and they nested, and she counted the nests, and then she went through and she deep tilled. Deep till is about 16 inches. Farmers often disc, so go like 4 to 6 inches every year, but then deep till every 3 years in the Central Valley. She deep tilled and found that 50% of the nests of the bees were killed. So bees are still able to survive here, but it might be sink habitat. And they are nesting in fields. So my research has shown that bees nest at equal rates in fields and in field margins. So, but I'm only finding very specific bees. So the question really is, well, can all bees do that? Or is it mostly like, she was looking at squash specialist bees. I look at sunflower specialist bees. One of the hallmarks of a specialist is that they really like to nest right by their host plant. So if you have a field of sunflower, a sunflower bee is like, this is great, I'm gonna nest right at the base of the plant, right? So how generalizable are our results to all the other bees, especially the rare bee species? I don't know. It's good for the farmers who care about pollinators of that crop. So the long and the short of it is, we don't know yet. I've looked at a lot of different things. Soil particle size, so how much sand, silt, clay. Not a lot of trends. Mostly bees don't like soil with clay. Those get really waterlogged, so they tend to prefer better drained soils, but that's the most we can say. There's tons of variability. Electroconductivity, so when farmers fertilize, salts accumulate in the soil. So I thought, well, maybe saltier soils aren't great for bees. They seem to be okay. What else have we looked at? One of the things that people have found is that bees tend to orient their nests towards the morning sun. So they like this kind of like nice solarization. They also often, some species like more slopes than, which might have to do with drainage than flat ground. But it's also, again, not true across the board. So,
do they interact with any other type of species ground at all, or
yeah, so there are like these really cool wasp things called mutilids, velvet ants. You guys heard of them or seen them? Okay, so velvet ants are a bee nest parasite that'll go in and attack them. One of the things that I actually want to study for my postdoc, which I'm like starting to write proposals for, is bee-ant nest interactions. So we know that ants and bees interact on flowers, and the interactions are negative. So the ants drive away the bees, but we don't know whether or not the ants find the bees' nests. Bees tend to put a secretion around the outside of their nest. So often when you find a bee nest, you find another one really close to it. And so bees might be drawing each other in, but maybe that chemical that they put at the outside of their nest helps deflect other invaders. So we don't know. So this is a really cool field. If you guys want to get into entomology and study bee nesting, it is like open playing field. You can ask tons of questions. One of the things that I researched this past year with a senior thesis student that I had, and my lab always has tons of projects. I'm graduating soon, so I don't have any more, but if you're interested, I can hook you up with cool people or apply to do like a URAP or something with us. We love smart students who are interested in this stuff. But we looked at irrigation. So you would think flood irrigation, where you just flood a field, right, which would kill bees and like deter them from nesting there. versus drip irrigation, which we already know is really great for erosion control, right? Like doesn't use as much water, it's just generally better. I thought we would see so many more bees in drip irrigated fields. And we saw absolutely no difference in nesting or abundance. So bees are just, they're plastic, I think. I think they're willing to accept more conditions than people think. Speaking of plastic though, interestingly, terribly, there's some research on the East Coast that found that there are some species of hairy belly bees, so bees that don't nest in the ground, but nest in abandoned beetles. So if you have like a stem, beetles make holes in it, and the bees will make their nest there, and they'll stack it like this. They'll use flower petals or leaves, they're also called leaf cutter bees, to make these divisions and put their pollen balls. They found that bees were collecting plastic bags from the environment to make these dividers. Which isn't very good because plastic doesn't have very good respiration, so there could be more like fungal problems with the pollen. But another thing to consider. Okay, so let's quickly touch on conservation strategies because we all want to know what we can do to help the bees. One, sign this petition and definitely try and limit or ban neonicotinoids.
And make other people sign it.
Yes, I wholeheartedly advocate for that, especially about better pesticide practices. People often in their backyard use more pesticides per area than a farmer does. Even though farmers use a ton because they have really big acreage, they go through all of these trainings, but people don't, and they often don't know what chemicals are in the pesticides that they're using. So a lot of you might have heard about the big bumblebee die-off in Oregon last year. They were spraying flowers, at the height of their bloom, and they killed 50,000 bumblebees, right? Just this because the labels didn't really say hey, this contains a highly toxic, chemical to bees. And yeah, they basically had to put screens over these trees, and the bumblebees were still trying to get to this really attractive floral resource, even when they had a physical barrier. So educating the public about this, I think, is really important. Pollinator Garden. So my front parking strip was just super weedy, and I've actually done this with a few friends too. We just go, you put wildflower mixes, bees love sage, just any native plant really. Put it there, it looks awesome. Your neighbors walk by and compliment you. You can even do it if you're renting because it's just really beautiful. It's a way to attract pollinators in urban areas. And then of course, in agricultural areas, you want to diversify them. So people, and I'll go through this, I think. I don't have a ton more time, or do I?
You got till 6.
I could probably talk the whole time. So diversifying them. Polyculture, really great for bees, but even just putting hedgerows, so tiny little strips of native plants along big agricultural fields is really good. Protecting remnant habitat, so keeping what we have, really important, and then restoring degraded habitats, making them better. What got me into this in the first place, right? Creating better habitat for bees. So in agricultural areas, there are a lot of different places that pollinators can nest, but some of the best, of course, are these remnant natural habitats, but in the Central Valley, there's very little. So the closest thing that mimics what California used to look like is rangeland. Rangeland is actually really good for native plant conservation too, so that's part of it. It helps maintain forest communities with the small shrubs, or the small non-shrubs. And so this was a map that doesn't come out very well by a former grad student in our lab, and she was looking at rangelands that abut areas where there's a lot of pollination demands. And so this shows kind of, I can't remember what county, this might be Fresno or county, but showing where there's a ton of rangeland and a ton of crops that are pollinator dependent. So if you wanted to really focus your energies, that would be a really good spot. So this is kind of what my study system looks like. Here are some sites. This is Winters, Davis is over here. Here's the Dunnigan Hills, so some naturalish rangeland, burrell habitat. But you can see some of these sites are much closer to natural areas than others. They're just in the middle of other natural landscape or non-natural landscapes. So we'll go over kind of like, if you're close to natural habitat, maybe you're really lucky and you get lots of native bees, whereas if you're here, maybe you should diversify your farm. You can also, so if you're thinking about not just the farm scale, but kind of this larger scale of where you're going to apply your efforts, you could kind of scatter them throughout the landscape and not maybe get a really good net benefit. You could put all of your efforts along some sort of habitat feature, so this spans a lot of different property boundaries and all the adjacent farms might benefit, or you could try and get farmers to kind of concentrate their efforts and create a really big piece of habitat that would benefit all of them around them. You come into kind of issues where a lot of farmers don't want to work at this scale and plan.
So, just a question, are you saying here that it's more beneficial to have a dense cluster of habitat than have it kind of spread out, or is that still?
Well, so this gets,
uncertain?
yeah, there's like the whole SLOSS debate, single large or several small, in conservation biology. So if you have just a small habitat, does it provide enough resources for a population to flourish? Whereas if you have like a really large habitat, you can have a lot more resources and greater potential for things to sustain themselves over time. But if you can only do small ones that are scattered, that might be a great strategy. You kind of have to work with what you've got. But right now, the dominant mentality is like having a big swath is going to sustain more species for a greater amount of time. I mean, if you could get farmers to work at this kind of regional level and kind of towards a common good, that would be super awesome. I haven't seen any projects taking these guys kind of up on it right now. You just see like little bits here and there.
So no one's doing borderlands? Like each of those is a specific farm?
Yeah, so right now people would put like a little bit along an edge of their farm, but not really big patches that I know of. And I'm talking about, you know, big scale agriculture here in the US. In Europe, they're doing a much better job. And in other parts of the world, they have small farmer systems that are much more diversified. And so they're doing a great job. Like if Miguel Altieri was here, he'd get upset saying that. But so like we have models of what you can do. We're just not doing it here in our own country. And we're exporting our model of agriculture to other countries, which are doing bad things. So, sorry that none of this really shows up. But here's like native bee visitation and distance from natural habitat. So if you remember, I showed you there was like natural habitat, and I was like, well, what happens if you get farther away? If you're right next to natural habitat, it turns out that you can get all of your pollination needs met by native pollinators. There's tons of them spilling over from natural habitat into croplands. When I talked about watermelon, for example, really high pollination demand, you wouldn't even need to import honeybees to your farm. Whereas if you're in the middle of other farm fields, you're getting almost no native bee visitation, and so you're going to be really dependent on honeybees. This is another study that didn't just look at like conventional agriculture, but looked at organic farms that were near to natural habitat, organic farms that were far from natural habitat, and then they couldn't find a lot of conventional farms near, so they just had conventional far. You can see that for diversity and pollen deposition, if you're an organic farm, so you have local diversity and landscape diversity, you're going to have higher bee diversity and higher pollination. If you're an organic farm and you're far away from natural habitat, you'll still see an increase over what a conventional farm sees, but not as dramatic. So what this says is that this is kind of a really similar thing, but that substituting basically conventional farms surrounded by natural habitat or an organic farm in a sea of unnatural habitat have about the same level of like pollination services or attractiveness to native bees. But the best is an organic farm, the top red line, in natural habitat, and the worst is a conventional farm surrounded by other conventional farm fields. Different scales. Here's another way to think about this. So you can have diversity at all these different scales, at the landscape scale, at the field scale, and even within your own plot by just moving your crops around, right? And there's a variety of ecosystem services that we talked about, but all of these can contribute to your level of pollination services. So basically, you need to think about pollination services with this multi-scalar view, right? Not just one thing, but all of these are going to contribute to whether or not you'll have it. And so what I particularly study, I'm going to talk to you about now, are whether or not hedgerows, so a field scale study, right? We just put something along a farm edge, can have an effect on crop pollination and preserve native bees. So the question really is, can pollination services be augmented through this kind of small scale habitat enhancement? So not really large coordinated efforts that I think are necessary, but something that farmers can actually do. There are programs that they can get money for to put these onto their farms. 90% cost share, so the government puts 90% of the bill, and they can toss it on there, irrigate it for a few years. It's mostly native shrubs. And then you get these beautiful hedgerows. So this is a hedgerow. Native grasses, this is ceanothus, California lilac. Right now what we try to do is put in plants that are going to flower over the whole season. So I told you earlier, there are bees that come out early in spring, middle of the year, and late. So you're trying to have plants blooming during all of those, so there's never a lack of resources for the pollinators in your system. They're very pretty too, I'd like to say. Okay, so again, you put it on the edge of a farm. This is kind of what they can look like if you put a lot of them. They also can function as kind of habitat or corridors for other species. Pollen tends to move along them. They're really good for pest control, so a lot of the natural enemies like them. They're going to the nectar resources. Yeah, they're pretty cool. So this is what a typical agricultural field margin looks like. This one gets a disc to remove weeds. They get burned. Sometimes they get herbicided to get rid of the weeds, but it's just kind of like a wasteland. There's some mustard in the background, but not a lot there. And this is next to a tomato field. Again, just to highlight, again, this is another tomato field. This is another hedgerow. This is a toyon. I think they have some sage. But very kind of like, even though it's not a ton, it's just a strip, it is a lot more resources than were there. So let's go through three main questions. Do native plant hedgerows increase native bee abundance and diversity? So how good are they for the bees? Do they export bees into the adjacent crops? And do these bees in the crops actually increase sunset? Right, these are the questions farmers are interested in. So number one, diversity. Yay! They do. So for richness and abundance, or richness and diversity, diversity basically just takes into account, it's like abundance weighted richness. Don't worry about it. If you take ComBio in the fall, though, I'll be your GSI and I'll tell you all about it. So this is for native bees and syrphid flies. There's some flower flies, hoverflies, that are pollinators too. But you see in hedgerows, the blank versus the striped control sites, you get significant increases in native pollinators. So they're doing really good. This is in California, but another system, this is in Arizona, they looked at similar things and actually found that these are two different periods of spring and summer. They found that hedgerows actually had a really strong effect on native bee abundance in the spring, but that compared to like fields and woodlots, it was pretty small in the summer. So some evidence that while hedgerows can be good, it might be region specific, crop specific, season specific. So it might not be the end all be all, but they are doing a good job. Okay, so if you have bees at the edge, do those bees, are they just attracted to the hedgerow, or do they actually go then forage in the crop, since we know we're increasing that? So the concentrator hypothesis would say that in a hedgerow, this orange line, you actually see a lot of bees in the edges, but not that many in the field. Whereas in the control site, you wouldn't really see an effect. Exporter, you would see some bees in the control going out into the field, but way more in the hedgerow edge and a lot more into the fields. So I'm just showing you these graphs so you know that when I show you the results, you can say, oh, which one of these hypotheses does it look like, right? Or no effect. Hedgerows and controls look exactly the same functions happening. So this is in canola. So they looked in the hedgerows, and then they looked at different distances into the field. And here's what they found. So pollen deficit is like how much more pollination would the plant need to fully produce seed set. And so you've got like GM, crops, conventional, and organic. And you can see that at all distances into the field, the organic crop has more bees. So in the edges and way into the field. So that would support the exporter hypothesis. Okay. The same thing is true in tomato, a buzz-pollinated crop. So if you look at sites with hedgerows versus without, you can see that there are more bees in the hedgerows and at 10 meters into the field and even halfway into the field, but when you get really far from those hedgerows, you don't see the effect. So they're having an effect up to a certain distance. And this is the same with canola as well, even stronger effect. So here in canola, the hedgerows are having an effect that covers the entire field. So you get a lot more bees, potentially a lot more pollination. So it all looks good, right? So far, like hedgerows are doing a good thing. And then finally, how does hedgerows impact seed set? So what you do is first you like pollinate a plant, and that gives you an estimate of its maximal seed set. You leave it open to just see what pollinators are doing, and then you can bag it. So what happens if no insects can pollinate it? So here's the sunflower, open versus bag. And then to find that pollen deficit, you subtract supplemental minus open. And if open is really low compared to the maximum, it means that you don't have a lot of pollinators. But if it's really high, like really close to the supplemental, it means that you've got a lot of pollinators. So back to this study that I talked about, the canola study. You can see the past graphs. So here's bee abundance. So again, in organic, conventional, and genetically modified fields, in organic you see higher bee abundance, which is more than conventional and more than GM. And you see a lower pollen deficit. So you have more bees, you have more seeds being set, right? This is really bad. I don't have this next to hedgerows. This is what my research is on. And sadly, I did this in sunflower, and I found no difference between conventional fields next to hedgerows or not. So it might be that because it's a conventional field, it's having a much greater effect than the hedgerow is, because it's such a big landscape. And I didn't look at organic, so I can't really be able to tease those apart.
Now, would they be able to, like if somebody really wanted to grow a GM crop, would they be able to plant, or is there any point in planting hedgerows around it, near it?
Well, the hedgerow still benefits the bees that are inhabiting it, but it might not benefit the crop. If they're adverse or choosing not to pollinate that crop, then they'll just be in the hedgerow. So it still is probably good to have them in the landscape from our perspective, wanting to conserve them, but from the farmer of the GM crop, it might not be as good to put in a hedgerow.
Are we assuming that the GM crops are using the equivalent amount of like herbicides and pesticides that the conventional ones are? Okay, so it's by virtue of them being GM. And what would off-put bees from pollinating the crops?
I mean, I think in this case, they might have, it might be Roundup ready, or I can't remember what the genetic modification was, but they might already be expressing something that the bees are not interested in.
Interesting. So like, I don't know, I was just at this one conference where she was geneticist was saying that like using GM crops with organic agriculture techniques, would maybe be like in her mind is a good thing, and so like that might be an interesting.
What would be interesting, I think, is to do preference experiments. So with bees, sometimes times what you can do is you can put them into flight chambers and have different floral resources for them to choose from and see what they prefer to go to. And so it would be really cool to put in, canola that hasn't been sprayed, conventional, something sprayed, and then a GM crop, and see if bees are like just going to them randomly or if they always prefer one. That would be a really cool study.
Do we all know what GM are for? Like what they do with GM crops? Because people have this, like when I was doing like label GMOs, like seriously, like a third of people, maybe half, don't even know what that word GMO means. And then just like you get kind of this idea, like I talk to a lot of people like, oh, GMO, it's bad. And they're like, but it's science, but do people know what the industry is doing with GMO crops, or like what perceptions people have? Like there's basically only 3 things that they do. I mean, you get like weird things like, these tomatoes that don't freeze, but there's basically only 3 things that are done with GMO crops. One is to put pesticides inside of the plants. And then another thing you asked about, like with the pesticides and that, is now we're finding that when you make GMO pesticides, somehow insects are more quickly able to adapt to that. Same thing with the herbicides. Then if we just spray them on there, like spraying the pesticides. So now, especially like 2012, 2013, is we're getting a lot of GM crops that are double sprayed, because the pesticides that are inside of the crop aren't working, so they spray more pesticides on them. So you got double pesticides. Herbicides, Roundup Ready to make the plants so that they don't die. When they spray them with Roundup, is basically like a genetically modified fungus, right? And they started spraying that in Plan Colombia to kill cocaine and marijuana, but they never did, And then the other thing is these terminator seed technology, which basically makes the plants sterile, so every year farmers have to buy new crops. So these are the things that GMOs are being used for. Like it's there's all these things, like you listen to science, oh, we can make this and this and this useful things, but also just organically, we've always had enough food to feed everyone. Like no one dies because there's not enough food, it's because it's political. That's why people are dying, or we don't care enough to build these transportation resources out to specific
and I guess my question would be like, which one of those intersects most with like pollinators?
I mean, it would probably be when they put pesticides into it, but I think herbicides too. Like if there's enough in the plant, the herbicides have been shown in monarchs, right, to have really bad effects. And I'm not aware, maybe you are, of studies that have looked at that with bees, but
neonicotinoids are killing butterflies too,
But herbicides, I'm not.
No, I haven't looked at bee preference.
And that was mainly my question. It's like we've discussed at the very least in this class, Gina and I have my own opinions of it, but like as far as like in relation to bees and what's happening with them, like it would be, I think, be a really cool study to see, like because you do have those arguments saying like, well, GM and being a very general term, might have something to do with this like sustainable future, which I have my reservations.
No, I think GM has a lot of promise in how it's pitched, right? Like being drought tolerant, salt tolerant, having all these great traits that can help withstand climate change. But you're right that in practice, it comes down to being a lot about like,
food control.
About controlling the food, like controlling the pesticide and herbicides, and controlling whether or not farmers can keep their own.
I just want to say one other thing, also what's creepy is like all the seed companies are being bought by 4 companies, Monsanto, DuPont, Syngenta, and Bayer. And they together, those 4 companies collectively own half of the seed companies in America. And and so that's another thing, with these Home Depot pesticide plants is, like a lot of local nurseries, they're like, well, where do we get plants so we can be guaranteed, don't have these neonicotinoid pesticides like already on them. And because these 4 companies, and all of them use neonicotinoids, right? And because they're trying to control the food. And and so it's like half the seed companies, are using these pesticides on the seeds. So I don't know, it's pretty, I think this is like a thing that, is not really on a lot of people's radar, and it should be, and it's like a very creepy thing, but yet people are like, they don't You know, it's like people aren't ready for this kind of sci-fi dystopic nightmare. You know, like they just, well, no, things have been this way, and this is my normal life, but they don't, you know, understand. It's actually like nefarious, in my opinion.
I'd like to see Hillary finish the
Oh,
presentation.
sorry,
yeah.
And
Yeah,
then,
sorry.
maybe a few
And then
more
we can-
conversations.
yeah.
Okay.
But I do agree with a lot of what you're saying. And there's a cool film that they just screened recently, maybe at La Peña, I can't remember, that was about the concentration of the seed industry, a documentary that interviewed a lot of farmers. And I saw a clip from it, I wasn't able to go, but it was like very emotional for them. So it wasn't just about, you know, the diversity, but yeah, it was very interesting. So basically I was saying very quickly, so it looks like hedgerows are doing a good job. Might be crop dependent, but you know, I think we need a lot more research, always, right, as a scientist. But I do think the evidence is, like, if people were to put them in all over, that would be great. Ideally, and I'm sorry I didn't talk about polyculture, I forgot what I quite put in this, but polyculture does also increase bees. So I think encouraging farmers to kind of shift their methods is the goal. And putting in hedgerows. And so, you know, this just kind of shows like the cost benefits, like this is what farmers really care about. So if you put in a hedgerow and you don't have a cost share program with the government, it takes a really long time, so this is a number of years. So after about 3 or 4 years is when the plants start blooming and attracting pollinators and having that potential benefit to the crop. So without a cost share, it takes a lot longer to see the flip where you start gaining profits from putting in a hedgerow. But with a cost share, it takes, you know, about 6 years to really start seeing an increase, and that increase goes up every year as you attract more pollinators. Farmers really like to see that. And then the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and even in the Farm Bill, there's they're basically trying to create more habitat through some programs that they have to encourage farmers to plant pollinator habitat. So they are trying to do that. And then finally, I just wanted to say that there are initiatives that are trying to certify farms as being bee friendly. I wouldn't say that they're quite like to the fair trade guidelines yet. Right now, farmers can like certify themselves, and if you're a beekeeper, you automatically get to be certified. But anyway, so I have some issues, but I do think it's an interesting trend, just another way to promote awareness. So I just wanted to really quickly summarize just that pollinators are incredibly important and more important in the face of honeybee collapse, but they're very important for like our nutrition, right? So we benefit from having pollinators. Pollinators are enhanced when we diversify farm systems with hedgerows and with other methods that I didn't quite present upon today. And you know, if we want to protect our food future, I think pollinators are a big part of that, you know, for outcrossing plants and just maintaining things other than honeybees, because who knows, maybe we'll have, you know, these GM honeybees that are resistant to neonicotinoids, but we'll lose a lot of our other really important.
And everyone will have to get their bees from Monsanto.
Right, which would be terrible. So with that, I leave you, so male bees don't go back to their nests at night. These are longhorn bees. You can see by their long antenna, the ones I was going to use up and down the road. But they hang out on the flowers at night and cuddle each other. You can even pick up male bees. Male bees don't have stingers. Stings are the ovipositor, so only female bees do. So you can pick them up, they'll buzz at you, but they're really cute and cuddly. And adorable. So, oh, and if you're interested in native bee research, I summarize scientific articles on my blog. I try to do it once a week, but I don't always manage to quite do that. But you can always check me out online and see what cool stuff I'm writing about, or what cool stuff scientists are doing. So yeah, we can talk for a little while, or you can go, whatever.
Thank y'all so much. Thank you, Hillary.